Welcome to the show. This is the Magician and the Fool podcast, and we are on episode number 34. My name is Dominic, and my co-host's name is Janice, and today we have the pleasure of speaking with Mr. Christopher Plaisance about his new book, Evocating the Gods. Christopher is an independent humanities scholar, researching topics within the fields of the history of philosophy, religion, and Western esotericism from the methodological perspectives of classical philology and discursive archaeology. He holds a master's in Western esotericism from the University of Exeter's Center for the Study of Esotericism and a bachelor's in philosophy from the American Military University. He works professionally as a cyber threat hunter and lives in southeastern Pennsylvania with his family. You can find a lot of Christopher's works on academia.edu as well as on his website, philologia.io, philologia.io. We had a really fascinating discussion with Mr. Plaisance today on this show. I think it's a great compliment to his book. If you have it, Chris is able to go in depth on some of the important points that he makes in the book and some of the important topics and subjects that he covers. So I think it's a valuable discussion, whether you have the book or not, but definitely we would recommend checking that out through Avalonia Press. Before we get going, as usual, we have to say thank you to our Patreon supporters. It still blows us away that there are people out there helping support what we do. It really motivates us to keep going. So again, thank you, as always, sincerely. If you would like to support what we're doing, help keep the show going, that would be amazing. You can just go onto Patreon and donate what you can, one time or reoccurring monthly. We dedicate this work to Hermes and Asclepius, and may the merits we accumulate doing this work be extended to all sentient beings, so that they, together with us, may equally realize awakening. Okay, welcome to the show. We are here with Chris Plaisance, and we are here to talk about his new book, Evocating the Gods, Divine Evocation in the Greco-Egyptian Magical Papyri. And we're really excited about this. Thanks for coming on the show, Chris.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
Really glad to have you. This is going to be a valuable addition to our series on theurgy. I'm really excited about this.
Yeah, it'll be good to talk about the book and some of the concepts that we deal with in it.
Right. So first, right off the bat, I want to deal with some terminology issues. I mean, I can't believe you've published this book and you misspelled a word right here on the cover. I mean, that's kind of strange. But so what's with the word evocating? It seems to be kind of controversial.
Yeah, so the book itself is a philological study, and most of what I do is involved with philological approaches, looking at word history and the history of the use of language within different contexts of the Western esoteric traditions. And since this was, a study in the vein of classical philology, a lot of the work that I did dealt with historical sources of the language itself. And when I started looking at the word theagogia, the Greek term for divine evocation that the book is, mostly concerning, all of the lexica that I found from the kind of the middle of this past millennium, 1600s, 1700s, 1500s, they all defined theagogia with the Latin deorum evocatio. So the title of the book was initially going to be deorum evocatio, but I was actually cautioned against that by my editors, who said I should make an English title for it, because that would be a better title for non-technical people. But the title that I ended up coming up with, Evocating the Gods, is kind of a callback to these early modern Latin translations of the Greek. And the word evocate itself was more commonly used earlier on as a translation specifically for the present infinitive form of the Latin evoco, which is evocare. So that is kind of the way the title ends up calling back to these past technical discussions and definitions of the word.
Great. Yeah, I mean, I love the word. I don't know why it caused such a stir, but so before we get any further, maybe let's backtrack and talk a little bit about yourself and how did you get involved specifically in this work? How did this come about?
Yeah, so I started studying philosophy, right as out of the bat as my undergrad. It was my focus, and when I studied philosophy, I was mostly interested in the ancient Greek and late antique phases. So Plato, Aristotle, the Middle Platonists and Neoplatonists that followed afterwards. And after finishing that, I went on to do a master's work at the University of Exeter's Center for the Study of Esotericism, where I ended up completing my master's there in the history of Western esotericism. And during the course of that, I decided to focus as much as I could on the late antique experience, specifically on Iamblichus, the Neoplatonist, and the Greco-Egyptian magical papyri. So I had done some previous work on Iamblichus's book, De Mysteris, during the course of working on the master's. So when I sat down to do the thesis, the dissertation, I knew that I wanted to reach back into that same set of currents. So I was sifting through De Mysteris, looking for maybe some unanswered questions that I had never read about in other secondary sources, seen papers or books specifically on that. And the thing that caught my eye was, Iamblichus is having this discussion about this weird-looking word, theagogia, and why it's so bad. And that really caught my interest because, in reading all the secondary literature on Iamblichus, on, the Greek magical papyri, this was not something that had previously jumped out to me as a big point of discussion. And the more that I started looking into this, the more it came to me that this was kind of a gap in contemporary scholarship on these works. And there hadn't been a lot of really in-depth and detailed discussion around the term or the context within which it rested within these various pieces of literature. There's really hardly anything more than a handful of quotes and glosses in various dictionaries and lexicons surrounding this. So the whole project for the master's thesis kind of grew out of an examination of this word, theagogia, and developing an understanding of the philosophical, religious, and magical contexts of the word within the broad scope of all the literature in which it appeared. So that was kind of the thrust of my master's work there, and the book kind of grew out of the completed master's thesis.
I know we're going to have to expand on this. Theagogia, can you define it for us here, just so we have some context moving forward?
Right. Yeah, so at the root, it's two suffixes, so theos and agoge. Theos means God. Agoge is usually used to mean to draw down or to pull towards. So when pushed together, there are a lot of technical terms that you find within the Greek magical papyri that are constructed in this way, where you have, one noun and then the agoge suffix used to indicate the evocation of whatever this subject is. And in this case, it's the evocation of a god, which in itself is a very curious term, because when we think of evocation, we don't usually think of gods. We usually think of lesser tiers of beings, such as daemons, spirits, things like that. So to even think about this kind of a linguistic construction is itself very unusual.
Yeah. And can you, for our audience, maybe contrast evocate and invocate? You do cover this in your book, but it's something maybe we should quickly get out of the way.
Right. So typically when you use these kinds of words nowadays, when you see contemporary esoteric discourses using the words invocation and evocation, invocation is typically seen as something that is done to a being that occupies kind of a higher metaphysical or ontological position than the magician who's performing the invocation. So you would invocate a god or an angel or something that is higher than you, whereas an evocation is something that is done to a being over which you have power. And when you start to look at the relationship between these two terms within the context of theurgy in late antiquity and the resulting kinds of magical practices that developed out of that in the 19th century and continue on today, you end up with a very strict dichotomy where the relationship between invocation and evocation is such that the magician is seen to invocate a deity so that power can be kind of secondhand granted to them, so that the evocation of a deity who exists within the subordinate hierarchy of that god can be evocated. So invocation for the purpose of evocation. Where that gets turned on its head with theagogia is that there is no intermediacy involved. You strictly have evocation of a god by the magician, which is unusual in the terms, that there is no intermediacy, but also in that you have a subject which is usually, more properly invocated being evocated. So it's a very curious term around which kind of a very curious practice develops.
Yeah, and it's pretty muddy, as you point out in your book. They kind of fluctuate back and forth. Sometimes you're evocating, sometimes you're invocating, and sometimes you're doing one in order to accomplish the other.
Yeah, it's a very the practice that you find within the Greek papyri and within some of the demotic and the bilingual texts is not one where there are very clear-cut religious or kind of philosophical schemas in place. So when you look at the way theorists like Iamblichus or like Proclus would describe these kinds of terminologies, it's kind of almost an ivory tower perspective where you have someone sitting down and saying, hey, I think that this is the ordered structure of the universe as I see it. So these kinds of practices only make sense within this pre-ordered image. But when you go down and look at the situation on the ground with the papyri that were being written by those operators who were doing this and writing these spells, it's a very different picture. And everything, as you say, it's very muddy. You don't find clear distinctions in many cases. You find lots of blurry corners where concepts that from the position of a philosopher may be clearly defined, clearly delineated, are not so. The boundaries are more fluid when you look at the writings of the magicians themselves. So it's an interesting contrast there between the two kinds of sources that we look at when examining these kinds of things.
Yeah, and I think it's hard for a lot of people who like things black and white, laid out in a very linear fashion, to kind of wrap their heads around this kind of stuff. I mean, it's confusing. Definitely,
and especially when you start to think about the terms that are, when you look at this from a linguistic perspective, especially the terms that are used within the magical papyri are not necessarily given the same kind of meaning within those texts that they would be in the lexicons, that scholars of the time would have written out, or that other, more academically minded philosophers and theologians are using. So you can find examples, all abound throughout antiquity, where you have words like, mageia or goeteia, terms for sorcery being defined, by Plato or being defined by any of the early church fathers, as meaning one thing. But it becomes clear when you start to look at the context and the usage of these terms within some kind of a source like the magical papyri, the meaning to the magicians was often very different than the meanings imparted on these words by non-practitioners that were writing about them.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think the word daemon is a great example too. You point this out. I mean, there seems to be a blurry line historically between spirits of the dead and daemons, as well as the word daemon and gods themselves, which...
Yeah, it's definitely true, and that is kind of endemic of the blurry lines that you find within the magical texts, especially. And I think that so often, these kinds of words and concepts, may be intentionally used by the magicians because of the blurriness and the liminality surrounding these. And the demon is a particularly, good example of this, because it kind of straddles every line imaginable. On the one hand, you do have that distinction where there's confusion. Is a demon a god, or is it some kind of lower order servitor of the gods? And then on the other hand, you have the same kind of distinction, like, is it a soul of the dead, or is it something else that emanates strictly from the gods and doesn't have anything to do with the dead? And within the magical papyri, all of these meanings come into play in, one sense or another, in one spell or another. There's a very fluid relationship between all of these meanings. And in one of the spells, we see this really evidenced when they talk about the necrodemon, which I think would be a great name for a metal band if anybody's going to do that.
Totally.
But it's...
Or a good gore B movie.
Oh, yeah, totally. But it just really, kind of it allows that liminal nature to really sink in, because you have so many different, aspects that are coming into play that kind of coalesce around this figure of the demon, who is at once associated with the gods below, and on the other hand is also distinctly associated with the souls of the dead, kind of coalescing around this one figure that's being evocated in that kind of psychagogic spell.
And do you think this is maybe where people like Iamblichus and Zosimos had trouble with the sorcerers, in that the terminology was so all over the board? And to throw into the mix, there were a lot of hucksters and charlatans as well.
Just like today.
Yeah, I mean, with Iamblichus, I think it's very interesting for him because, as opposed to many of the other Platonists, when you read De Mysteris, you see that he is himself a practitioner of theurgy. And, his book provides us with one of the best kind of hands-on guides of how to do theurgy. It's really one of the shining examples in all of late antiquity for that. So to see him railing so strongly against theagogy and against thaumaturgy and against all these other practices, it's very interesting to look at his arguments. And when you kind of examine where his problem comes from, it's not so much a practical problem as it is a theoretical problem, in that he's not necessarily saying this is wrong because it doesn't work, or this is wrong because you're a faker. I'm sure there were, and I'm sure he would rail against the fakers as well. But with theagogy, it's more on the line of this is an impious practice. And this goes back to the problems that Plato even had with practitioners of magic, where the biggest issue is that it's an impious way of relating to the gods.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at Iamblichus's, his clear-cut method in the latter part of De Mysteris for evocating demons, he is the one that really lays out in crystal clear order, this kind of structure of the evocation, where if you want to evocate a demon, you must first invocate the deity that presides over this demon. And the act of invocation is, in Iamblichian terms, always a very pious act of theurgic devotion. It's never something where the operator or the magician coerces the deity or exerts any power over them. The invocation is done not by you doing anything to the deity, but by you changing yourself into a vessel which is suitable for, inhabitation by the deity or its powers or something like that. So the idea from this Iamblichian perspective, where invocation is this eminently pious and holy act, that you would have this practice of theagogy where the gods themselves are being treated in the exact same manner as the demons that are coercively evocated by a sorcerer. It's just like a huge monkey wrench thrown into the whole mechanics of his system, and it doesn't seem like it should work. And even if it did work, man, like, you're really wrong for even trying to do this, because it's a very impious way of even approaching the gods.
Yeah, it's an interesting conundrum. I mean, it's something that I struggle with. I believe Janice as well. I mean, if you don't have a level of purity, if you're not receptive, if your vessel is not, if you're not a proper vessel, can you be assured that you are even communicating with the gods? Can anyone off the street just walk up, pick up a book, and say some voces magicae and get the same results? It's definitely an interesting question.
Well, and if you take the Iamblichian hierarchy seriously, even if one is successfully invocating a deity, at what level of the hierarchy is this invocation occurring? Mm-hmm. Because when you look at the epiphanies between the noetic gods, the psychic gods, and then on down to the hylic archons, things get really muddy really fast. And maybe a hylic archon isn't what you think you should be shooting for, but that might be what you get, depending on the structure of how the invocation is performed.
Right.
Well, and there's the issue of ontology. I mean, I think part of what Iamblichus is talking about relates back to the structure of the universe, or the structure of the cosmos at least, and the nature of authority being primarily resident in the anterior and primal principle that produces the later productions, the later beings on the chain, as it were.
Definitely. And I think that's where his problem with theagogy ultimately stems from this metaphysics and the ontology that informs the metaphysics. You can't have things that are contingent commanding those things on which they depend ontologically. It just doesn't make any sense to him. So I get the sense, in reading his arguments against theagogy, that it just kind of offends him intellectually that, it would even be theorized that such a thing is possible.
Absolutely. And I think that Iamblichus has this Gnostic dimension to him. It seems to me when I read De Mysteriis and reread over the years, because it needs that, it definitely seems to me that on one hand you have a brilliant theorist, clearly trained in a rigorous way as a philosopher and theosopher, but on the other hand, you, as you mentioned, Chris, you have a practical you have a practitioner here, somebody who's doing this work. And I think the piety that we see in Iamblichus originates in direct experiences, which were the result of his practices. And I think that his frustration with people misunderstanding comes from that experience of the deity, and that understanding that the daimons, even the daimons that are higher on the chain, or angels, depending on what you're working with, they may contain and reveal the characteristics and tokens of the deity, but they shouldn't be mistaken for the actual sort of Hinad.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, there are very interesting ways with which Iamblichus kind of presents the the descent of the divine into the natural and the material world. I mean, Greg Shaw has been really kind of groundbreaking in, presenting his perspective on Iamblichus that, in distinction to Porphyry and, the Gnostics and a lot of these other, Middle Platonic strains of thought that were happening at the time, where you do have strong dualism, you don't have that same dualism in Iamblichian philosophy and in his theurgy. You have a very strong sense that the divine descends fully into the material world, and that the material world itself is, wholly imbued with that emanative divinity. But at the same time, I do get the sense that there is a degree of ambivalence about the descent, because when the Hylic archons are discussed throughout the course of De Mysteris, they're not presented as the kinds of deities that one ought to be working with. You're always kind of given the sense that you should be working with, deities on the noetic scale or the hanatic scale, or somewhere higher up on the chain of emanation, and that the psychic and Hylic archons should really best be avoided because there are dangers with those epiphanies. And I think that is a big distinction between Iamblichian theurgy and the kinds of invocatory work that you see within the magical papyri themselves, where deities that were Iamblichus or Proclus to analyze them probably would be classified lower on the scale as Hylic deities or psychic deities. These are specifically invoked or even evocated within the context of the papyri. The subterranean, the infernal, the gods of earth. These are constant features in the papyri themselves, and you really can't have any kind of a discussion about the theology of the magical papyri without talking about these infernal gods and the whole attendant theology that comes with them.
Right. This makes me think, I believe Iamblichus warns against false images that you may succumb to by practicing certain sorcerous acts, which reminded me of, for one, contemporarily, Spiritism and Spiritualism, where, you hear Spiritistas, voodoo practitioners warning that you may not be getting the thing that you are calling upon. You may think you're getting a saint, but it may be something else. And you point this out in your book, PGM 4-930. There's a warning during kind of a theurgic working that says that at times when you intone the god evocating spell, darkness can be generated. So that kind of, for me, ties in that there's a possibility when you do some of these quote unquote lower forms of invocation, evocation, that you may be interacting with spirits that you, not necessarily the ones that you think you're bringing forth, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think if you were looking at this from a strictly Iamblichian perspective, where invocation is not something where you simply call out a name and hope that the thing that you're calling is the one that answers, but where you're specifically preparing a vessel, which can be inhabited by the deity or by whatever attendant angel or demon of the deity. It's the preparation of the vessel and problems with doing that I think would be the root of that kind of a mistaken invocation or a mistaken evocation. And if you're thinking about this from, again, Iamblichian terms, that would be where a lot of the knowledge base would perhaps be lacking with some of these street magicians or those kinds of individuals, where that strong, kind of network of correspondences that were used to, construct statues or to construct, material vehicles, which could be used in these kinds of invocative works, would not be properly done by someone that was not thoroughly educated in those strong systems and networks of correspondences.
It's fascinating. I mean, Zosimos, a contemporary of Iamblichus, says some very similar things I think specifically around the statue making. So that's interesting. Coming from an Egyptian priest, Iamblichus not pretending, but playing an Egyptian priest at one point.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I mean, I get the sense that this was, in all the sources that we read from that time period, these were pretty common principles, and they're principles that persist all the way through the medieval period and the Renaissance. Every time that Platonism was really rediscovered, you see the same kinds of things reasserting themselves with Ficino, Campanella. And it's the same song and dance over and over again, where, for invocation to be successful, if it's being done according to this method, then the correspondences must be known and the vessel must be prepared according to, whatever physical or, psychic paraphernalia best associate with the subject of the invocation.
Right. I think we could make this whole podcast about late Platonism. So, and that would be fine with us. But let's move back towards the magical papyri. Let's talk about some of the terminology for the magicians that you cover in your book, because some of them are more positive than others.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to use the term goez when I refer to the magician throughout the work. Because there's a strong tendency to make the goez into this antagonistic figure that is kind of diametrically opposed to the theurgist. But that's something that we really only see in books that are written either from a strictly theurgic perspective or from a church perspective, where these terms are used in a purely antagonistic way. And it's not something that we see in the magical papyri. When we do see the term goez or goeteia used, it's in a more neutral sense. So using it was kind of an act of rehabilitation here, just to portray the goez as, not something that is, necessarily separate from any of these other terms for magician, but as kind of a more general term for sorcerer or magician that applies to, most of these spells that we examine within the papyri, be they binding curses, spells of an erotic nature, necromantic spells, or things like that. It's all the same figure that is broadly associated with this.
Okay. Having said that, looking at the De Mordo Sacro, which is 4th century BC, they had some issues with sorcerers and goez as well, though, right? Weren't they also called beggars, jugglers? What's the context of that work?
Yeah, so I mean, and this is again, when you look at Gorgias and some of the, those texts around that time, and it's the same in Plato as well. The word goez and the practice of goeteia was used as a pejorative term by non-practitioners. So it's very common in these late antique and really ancient texts to strictly use that in a negative sense. But again, it's not magia. Magic was used the same way, and also as a pejorative in many of the same texts. And you see an equivalency a lot of the time where they're kind of used just interchangeably. One in favor of the other, depending on what the mood of the author was. Mm-hmm. But the same thing is not observed in the magical texts themselves. You don't see the magicians, denigrating themselves with their own terminology, but you see them. Yeah, I mean, they use the terminology as it applies to them. Sure. But what you don't see oftentimes are broad general terms for magic and magician used within the papyri. Typically, these are the kinds of terms that are used by outsiders talking about the papyri or those kinds of practices, but do not necessarily appear within the texts themselves. Within the magical papyri, you're almost always going to have very specific technical terms for an operation, which is the same case within most of the theurgic texts as well.
Cool. Thank you for clarifying that. So, looking at the spells themselves, it's fascinating how you break it down in your book, the progression and the lineage of the different types of kind of mechanics behind how these things work. Let's get into that if you don't mind. Maybe we'll start with what you start with in the book, the binding and constraining, and go from there.
Yeah, so a big part of what I tried to show with the book was this progression going from the binding curses to erotic spells onto the psychagogic and necromantic spells, and kind of culminating with the practice of theagogy itself. And with each section, what I try to show is that there is some kind of contextual relationship between the specific practices that are discussed in each one of these, kind of detailed sections, and the broader question of, what is theagogy and how is it interrelated with all of these other magical practices within the context of the papyri in late antiquity. So if we start with the issue of the binding curses, this I think is interesting to me because it seems almost to be the farthest from the practice of theagogy. These binding curses are typically going to be things where a curse is being leveled for purely malicious purposes, by a magician against some kind of a rival. And the idea that this could have something to do with theagogy seems unusual at first. But the more that we look into the mechanics of the katadesmoi, these binding curses that you see so prevalently used in late antiquity, the more that we see that the way in which they operated through demonic intermediaries relates kind of strongly to some of the examples that we see of theagogy. And it's kind of through this vector of, binding curses being operationally performed through these demonic intermediaries, through intermediaries of, the souls of the dead, that we see a pretty strong overlap between the practice of theagogy.
It's fascinating, and I really love how you lay it out. It's eye-opening, and this kind of work is very important, in my opinion. So moving on from the binding, I want to get into the leading. Like there's a type of spell which is more about leading, but there's an intermingling for sure. But before we get into the leading, can you maybe talk about the bridal theft issue, which I think is a huge part of this whole thing?
Yeah, so I was actually unaware of this before I started researching the book, and I thought that the issue of bridal theft and some of the the historical traditions there and the relation with some of the erotic spells was pretty interesting. So, one of the things that you see when you look at Greek and Roman history is this idea that, an unmarried girl, would be abducted as kind of a pseudo abduction in a ritualized format by the suitor or by the suitor's family or some of the men there prior to the wedding itself. And one of the things that we see evidenced in the papyri is a strong connection between these historical traditions of bridal theft and some of the spells themselves, where the violence that is, kind of enacted by these erotic spells against the, I guess you can only say, the intended victim of, what is an erotic enchantment, makes a little more sense when you look at this historical tradition of bridal theft. Because to a modern person, it seems kind of weird that, if you're trying to seduce a woman, why would you want to visit pain and torment on her? Which is pretty commonly done in these, strange erotic spells where, the magician is calling on, these demons or calling on the spirits of the dead or the gods to inflict great pain and torment on, the object of his lust so that she will, be brought to him or come to him. And what appears to be the case is that this is, at least in some ways, historically associated with these traditions of bridal theft, where, there is this violent component that necessarily goes into play, in the bringing together of the two sexes.
Yeah, I mean, it's super interesting, and you can see this in a whole host of spells in the PGM. I think you point out quite a few. The Sword of Dardanos would be one that people may be familiar with.
I think it's important not to superimpose the morality and values of the current time, well, of any contingent of this age onto antiquity, it's just going to muddy the waters and interfere with understanding it contextually.
I would 100% agree with that. I mean, there is nothing constant in terms of morality, and trying to police things in antiquity with whatever flavor of morality reigns the day is just bound to cause misunderstandings.
Yeah, and so this may be a little bit shocking to people who subscribe maybe a little bit more to the politically correct paradigms. This might not be the thing for them necessarily. And it's just fascinating that this violent compulsion in the erotic sense then moves on eventually towards the gods.
Yeah, and I mean, it's really all bound up with this idea of agoge, that the magical and we can kind of translate agoge generally as evocation. So this idea that evocation is this almost violent, coercive act of the operator, the magician, pulling something towards him, most often against its will. With the practice of the erotic enchantments, it's always against the will of his intended victim, which I think we can definitely call them nowadays. And the same is true when you move towards necromancy. The souls of the dead do not want to come to the magician. He has to bind them with curses or drive them with threats of punishment. And it's the same, that is true every time you look at this. So when you start to look at the way these practices link up, with, agoge kind of being generalized in the erotic sense, moving towards psychagogia, where the souls of the dead are evocated, towards the practice of theagogia, you see a broad continuum where this idea of forced, coerced, compulsive movement is being initiated by the magician, by whatever the subject of his evocation is, towards himself, typically by means of either actualized violence, threats of violence, or something of that nature, which is very different than any kind of pious invocation that you would see being the norm in other kinds of texts, specifically of the theurgic variants.
And what do you see as, from your study and your perspective, what gives the magician this authority to compel something like a god to do its will with threats?
It's really interesting because you see it evidenced in several different ways. Sometimes you do see the same kind of stacked layering of authority. Like if we look at the text that the primary exegesis in the last section is concerned, PGM 4 930. The subject of the evocation there is Harpocrates, so Horus the child. And at one point you see the evocation being accomplished by means of a kind of prior invocation, where another deity is invoked to lend the magician the authority to evocate the god Harpocrates. But at no point in the spell is it denied that Harpocrates is a god. Yet by the time he's invocated or evocated to visible appearance, the magician is standing on his big toe to keep him there, which is probably the most impious thing I could imagine, being written about a god. Like, you're going to stand on his toe to keep him from getting away. That's pretty wild. So it's interesting that in some ways you do see this kind of, Iamblichian perspective where you invocate in order to evocate, almost turned on its head, where, you're invocating one god to evocate another god, which might make sense, in whatever, theology that particular magician ascribed to. But in the sense of some kind of a henadic theology, where all the henads are essentially co-equal with each other ontologically, that idea makes no sense at all. So that kind of gets us back, to this idea that from a theurgist perspective, theagogia doesn't make any sense. The idea that you could compel a god by the intercession of another god is nonsensical. And if we start talking about some of the theagogic spells where the gods themselves are compelled by threats, that of course makes no sense from the theurgic perspective. And it kind of gets us back into this thinking about theagogy in that broader context of just general evocation, where it doesn't really matter to the magician what the subject of the evocation is, because the method is constant and the method works. So the magician may not have had any kind of a theoretical framework, but what they had was a tried and true method that from their perspective, was functional. So it didn't really matter how it was explained theoretically. It was just a fact that it worked. So they would apply the same method, if you're binding a foe, if you're, coercing a woman to you, if you're coercing the souls of the dead, or if you need to coerce a god, it's all the same, family of coactive magic that operates with the same kind of basic formulaic mode of practice.
I wonder, are you able to pin down when this started? Because it's interesting, if you read Homer, the Odyssey specifically, I'm thinking, but the same in the Iliad. They are never demanding anything from the gods. They are doing quite the opposite. And no matter how much they, try to be kind and pious, the gods are still pretty ruthless and petty at times. To be fair, Odysseus and all of those are pretty ruthless themselves, killing, murdering, stealing. So maybe it's justified. But when does this coercion begin in your eyes?
Well, so in terms of strict theagogy, so coercion as it applies to the gods, the first time that we see it is in PGM4. So, whatever kind of a broad date we can associate that, most likely, second or somewhere between 2nd and 4th century AD, is kind of the time that we first see this practice and this term evidenced in the Greek corpus. But the preceding practices with which it is connected, the binding curses, the other forms of evocation, these have much more long-standing roots within the Greek texts themselves, as well as other sources for magical texts and objects that we find in the Greek corpus. But what may come into play here is that particular mode of syncretism that we find within Greek Egypt, because we do have this Egyptian practice where it was more commonly evidenced in the older Egyptian texts for the gods themselves to be compelled either by each other or by a magician at times if certain words of power were known and could be uttered. So what I would theorize is that it's kind of a both and situation in terms of the emergence of this practice of theagogy within the Greek mind here. You have, on the one hand, all of these practices that are involved with coactive evocation that make sense for the subjects with which they were initially designed to function, other humans, demons, the souls of the dead. And then on the other hand, you have these older Egyptian practices that occasionally do involve the coaction or the compulsion of a god. You put these together in the same cauldron where you have magicians kind of trading spells back and forth, writing out bilingual spells so that one camp can do the spells of the other. It almost seems like you were bound to get this kind of confluence where the two traditions intermix, and the result is this bizarre practice of divine evocation.
One thing I want to mention is that I think it's necessary and important to understand that what we're describing here is a technique, a methodology. It's a means of employing a ritualized theurgic or magical technology. And so when you see the same pattern repeated, regardless of whether it's to evocate a god or a spirit or an underworld spirit, that isn't, at least according to my understanding, that isn't necessarily an indication, for instance, that the gods are equivalent to spirits of the underworld or spirits of the dead. It's just that there is a very similar methodology being used to interact with and communicate with and even control these beings. And I think that there's a train of thought. It's more of a modern train of thought than something you find in antiquity, that the underworld spirits or underworld gods are equivalent to the celestial and heavenly gods. And examples such as this methodology are cited as evidence of this. And I think that's a faulty line of reasoning, if at least according to my point of view. I don't know what your opinion on that is, Chris.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I think that, for all the fluidity that we see in the papyri, gods are still gods. There is a difference, despite fluid boundaries between a god that is called upon and a spirit or a soul or a demon. And there are some cases in which it may be unclear which is which, and there are definite practical similarities in which evocations can be performed on one group, which may also be performed on another. But I would agree that it doesn't necessarily tell us anything about the theoretical understanding of magicians, that these things would have been equated as all existing in one kind of category that sits at the same ontological level. I don't think that is borne out by the texts at all.
And I was just curious, Chris, personally, I may be coming from a more too much of an Iamblichian kind of perspective when I think of some of these things, but specifically when you're stepping on the god's toe, for me, the way I work it out is that it is a daimon of the god. It's the equivalent of the god in the realm in which you are able to perceive the god. I don't know. How do you see that?
Man, I don't know.
Yeah, it's
I mean,
tough
as a personally, I am more on the Iamblichian side than probably anything else. So, one of the reasons that this subject appealed to me so much, initially, was that it did seem just strictly illogical. So kind of trying to understand where these magicians were coming from when they wrote about these things was an interesting kind of intellectual effort, because it does just seem so bizarre. And I don't really get the sense, especially in PGM 4 930, where Horus is being evocated, I don't see anything that tells me that this is conceived of Horus as being a demon there. It seems very much that Horus is conceived of by the author of the spell as a god, and that this spell is specifically designed to, coercively evocate this god to visible appearance. I mean, you have a section in the spell that's called, katachos to theo, that which restrains a god. It's not that which restrains a demon. It's very specifically outlined, so that this whoever is performing this spell is going to evocate and then restrain the god being evocated. It's very strange, and if you're coming at it from an Iamblichian or any kind of Platonic perspective, I don't think it's going to make sense.
Well, yeah, I mean, it brings me back to what we spoke about at the beginning, where there is blurry lines even between daimons and gods. So is it an issue of language too? I mean, do you think that's possible?
Well, I mean, despite whatever my personal philosophical or theoretical perspectives might be, I just try to examine the texts in their original context, and thinking about this in terms of what the original author might have meant.
Sure.
And I don't know that we can really extract a complete theology from this particular spell, because it's not that there's not as much there as we would need to do that. So trying to think about what the theological model would have been, in this author's mind, it's hard for us to say, but I am more inclined to think that this would have been conceived of more in the Egyptian sense, where these are gods, and by means of this formula, the magician is able to compel Horus to appear, to remain, and do whatever the magician is requiring of him. It seems to follow that matrix more than anything else.
Cool. Thank you. Sorry to put you on the spot with.
Yeah.
So would you say, so I like how your book is put together. I like the binding, the leading, the necromantic, and then the evocating. Would you say that those elements in one way or another are found pretty much in all of the PGM?
Yeah, I mean, I think the more broadly familiar you are with the text of the PGM, the PDM, and if you ever get a chance to get a hold of the Supplementa, you find the same things everywhere. You find this, mixed bag of all kinds of different spells. You might find, a binding curse right next to a spell to relieve a headache, or a spell to receive a theurgic vision right next to something that's designed to compel a lover into your arms. It's always very mixed, and even when you find things that are in the same hand on the same actual piece of papyrus, there's not necessarily any thematic relation between texts that we think may have been penned by the same scribe, which again makes you think that there was a broad continuum among these practitioners, where this kind of common thread of evocation is found throughout the vast majority of these texts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I was just looking through the PGM to see where I can apply this. People may be familiar with the very popular Stele of Jehu. It's interesting, that one, the way that's laid out. It seems to be evocation, and then finally invocation, and then there's a leading, but you're leading spirits then away for like an exorcism. So
right.
It's kind of a different twist, but still the same elements are there.
Yeah, I mean, if you can get a hold of a digital copy of the the actual Greek, if you can get access to like the Thesaurus Linguae Graecae to do some kinds of searches. If you look for any of these key terms, you find them just all over the papyri. Anything that involves agoge or any of those key kind of compulsory evocative terms are just manifest throughout the corpus.
That's awesome. That's fascinating.
I think that your point about some of the, I guess you could almost say, gritty approach of the works in the PGM, and I think to a lesser degree maybe the PDM, I think it's significant because it does present a variant from the sort of devotional attitude of an Iamblichian theurgist. And it certainly is somewhat at variance with Proclus's attitude toward these things as well. However, my argument has continued to be that even these ritualized acts are in a sense a form of piety, because they are a means of employing a certain set technology to interact with the gods. And I don't think that we should. I think that when we begin to impose a sort of judgment upon them, we're missing the point. And I think that there is considerable evidence for Egyptian antecedent practices. If you look at some of the Egyptian spells from things like the coffin texts and such, you do see this compulsory approach hand in hand sometimes with a pious and devotional approach, sometimes within the same series of spells. And I think that's an interesting indicator. And I think it's kind of a foreign concept to people these days, partially because of the culture we've grown within for a couple thousand years now, that separates magic and religion. And I think in order to really get inside of the heads of the people that were using and employing these spells and works, we have to sort of get outside of that dichotomy of magic versus religion and the sort of separation it creates. I think people nowadays, they'll look at the papyri, for instance, and they might say, oh, well, look at all of this compulsory material. This clearly is quote unquote sorcery. This has nothing to do with piety. And I think they're missing the point entirely, especially considering that the demographic of many of the people employing these actual, these spells weren't sitting on bookshelves in stores. They were hand copied and shared among magicians of that period who were itinerant. They would travel from town to town, set up shop. And if you go back to the Egyptian culture, prior to the Greco-Egyptian culture, this is what Egyptian priests would do. They would serve, well, the majority of them. There were some who served all year, but many of the people who were priests for part of the year, and then for the other portion of their time, they would travel and perform magic in the villages. And I'm sure that the hieratic temple practices were very different from the aims that their skills were employed for in a village, in villages in the area. Because when you're seeing the PGM, I think you're seeing those concerns reflected. People want a lover, or they want a lost loved one back, or they want success if they're a merchant in their business. But if you look at the spell of Astrosukos, again, we see a practical concern, success in business, merged with the sort of mystical and even, one could argue, pious attitude toward the god that's invoked in the text.
Yeah, it's definitely, there's a little bit of everything there. And I think the fact that you do have such, can we say base, or, not to denigrate it, but practical and material concerns mixed with very lofty texts. The Mithras liturgy is, one of the most characteristically theurgic spells, I think, in the entire corpus. And, to have these all side by side is, I think, rather indicative of, this kind of cast of characters writing the spells that are on the one hand, priestly in their motivations, but are on the other hand, deeply enmeshed in the world itself. So it's not the same kind of either or situation that we perhaps find in the Middle Ages in Europe, but it's a lot muddier, just like everything else was back in late antiquity.
Nicely said. Do you think this? We're talking more personally now. Could you be a totally unpious person and work these spells successfully? Can you have absolutely no regard for the gods or concern for the gods, but purely material concerns, and by the power of the magical names, the sacred names, would you have the same results as someone who was pious and was a proper vessel?
I don't think that you necessarily find discussions of magic throughout antiquity that would support that being a possibility. You might be able to interpret some of the instructions in the PGM as meaning like, all I have to do is just say these words and, put this bandana on my head, right, with the phylactery. But I do not think that it would have been understood in antiquity as being quite this simple. So often in those kinds of spells, you have some other, and do the usual as right, as part of the instructions in there. And this is where that kind of, this tradition of these hieratic priests would have been important, because, they would have understood, okay, well, do the usual means, I have to go through this whole, invocatory process to, do this kind of ritual of self-transformation first before this conjuration can be successful. And I think, when you look at the way these traditions developed into the early Middle Ages and throughout. There's always, no matter how, earthy the spells are, there's always some kind of a devotional component to them, whether it's evident or not, whether it's manifest or not. I think you're always going to find something there in the background that links the two.
Right. And some of them laid out pretty clearly, saying that you must remain pure for so many days and whatnot. Well, Chris, it's been awesome. You've covered everything I wanted to talk about.
Yeah, thank you both for having me on here and talking about it. It's really been great.
It was such a pleasure to have you. It was exciting to talk about this with you. And your book, I think, it's really consistent with the bar that's been set. We were really excited to have Edward Butler and Greg Shaw on the show, and I strongly feel that your contribution is right in line with their work. And we're trying, as one of the themes in this show, to focus on theurgy and late antique magic and things like that. And I'm grateful for what you're bringing into the foreground. And I think it's important also that you didn't dumb the work down, that you kept it scholarly and you kept a focus that was somewhat rigorous. I think that rigorous attitude is important because we have to be able to contextualize this material. We have to be able to understand this work that these people were doing with the proper attitude, and we need the tools to do that. As soon as we start to interpret this material outside of that, I think we lose a lot. Worldview is so important, and when you attempt to import say a modern materialist, rationalist attitude into it, or you attempt to even take a different magical paradigm and superimpose it upon it, say Solomonic magic. While there may be a line of development that connects the two traditions, I think it can do it a disservice because even the attitudes toward the spiritual creatures, as I think Henry Corbin would have called them. I think the attitudes are very different due to the influence of exoteric Orthodox Christianity. We're dealing with a period that there just wasn't. I don't even really think that was a thing at that point. So we have to be able, I think, to enter into the mind of, I hate using the word pagan, but pre-Christian. Pre-Christian spiritual practitioners, technicians of the sacred, you could say. Because I don't even know that if we use the word magician in today's parlance, it's fraught with issues. Because again, we're going back into that dichotomy between magic and religion. And to the Egyptian and Greco-Egyptian mind, there wasn't this hard, fast distinction between magic and religion.
Yeah, and I think when you're examining the, esoteric currents, for lack of a better term, of any period, this kind of deep contextual reading that is on the one hand, kind of placing your mind in the same worldview as the subject of your investigation, and in the same kind of moment as that, doing deep investigation on the words themselves that were used. What's the history of these words? What is the context of their usage within this particular time period? You're going to get really different results than if you start to look at things from a strictly modern perspective, or even worse, if you're kind of trying to superimpose a metaphysical schema of any sort, be it, materialistic, be it Kabbalistic, anything, onto, the thoughts and, philosophies of a different time period. It always has to be examined in its own context, for its own sake. Otherwise, you're going to get it wrong every time.
Nicely said. And it's just so much more rewarding to dive into those deep waters and try to get into their heads and get into the kind of the feeling of the time.
And for me, it's mentally refreshing too. It's from an early age in our culture where we're sort of inculcated with a way of viewing the world and this paradigm And it can be difficult even when we want to extricate ourselves from these influences to do so because of the just near constant saturation that we're presented with as a result of that. And for me, on a completely different level, just psychologically, it's been almost like a rejuvenating or healing process to do that, to step into the mind of somebody who lived in Alexandria during this time, for instance, and to really attempt to immerse myself in the way that they viewed the world and experienced the world, both material and immaterial. I think there's a lot to be said for it, and there's a lot to be regained, and whether, who knows, there could be an ancestral component to that. If reincarnation is the reality, it could be the revivification of prior modes of consciousness. And if even either of those things are unreal, it's simply a good sort of thought experiment.
Yeah, it's definitely a unique experience if you've never done it before, trying to just cast aside everything that you think you might know, not just about the subject itself, but about, the way the world works, and try and see something entirely from the perspective of someone at a completely different point, in time and place. Because all the underlying assumptions that we have about, the world get turned on their head as soon as you step back even a century. If you're looking at the 19th century, things are going to be radically different from the way they are now. And to go so far back as the 2nd century, you really have to be ready for a complete paradigm shift in terms of everything to really understand any of these writings from the perspective of the authors.
Absolutely. And if this sounds appealing to our listeners, then Chris's book, Evocating the Gods, is, I think, a very important piece of that puzzle, of putting that puzzle together, immersing yourself in this world in order to better understand the world at that time, but as well as the world now. So, Chris, where can people find this book? What else are you up to? Where could they get updates on what you're doing? Because I know you're a busy guy. You've got a lot of things going.
Yeah, so I try to keep everything updated on my website, philologia.io. That's philologia.io. I have a link to the publisher for my book on the website there, Avalonia. You can also find it, I know it's in some bookstores over in the UK. I haven't seen it yet here in the Philly area. Other major booksellers that shall remain nameless on the interwebs would probably have it as well, but I'm sure the publisher would prefer if you go straight to the source. My website also has all my other, published papers, book chapters and whatnot that I've put out over the years. As for what I'm working on now, I'm pretty interested in continuing the vein of research that my last paper was in. I took a break from doing historical work and wrote a strict philosophy paper. It's called Textual Realities, and it's an Aristotelian realist ontology of textual entities. And after doing all this philological research, I wanted to sit down and do some theoretical work on kind of the entities and terms with which the philologist deals. What is a book? What is a literary work? What is text? And in kind of wrestling with these issues, I found Aristotle's metaphysics to be the best guide. So I worked out an entire ontological schema around the practice of philology on Aristotelian terms, and kind of working in that same vein of looking to kind of revivify ancient philosophy in terms of solving modern problems. I'm currently doing some research with ethics from a broadly Aristotelian perspective, but more specifically, actually, a Thomist perspective, looking at Thomas Aquinas's Summa Theologica, to understand the best ethical practices for my occupation, cybersecurity, working in this broadly Aristotelian framework. That's most of what I'm up to.
Awesome. I love it. Thank you again. We loved the book. We loved talking to you. It's awesome material, awesome stuff. You bring a lot to the table, and we really appreciate you coming on to educate us as well as our listeners.
And thank you for your diligent work on this book, and your diligent work elsewhere too. I mean, you've been contributing a long time, and you put a lot of work into things, and I've noticed that your approach is always painstaking. And I know it can't always be easy. I'm sure that given your attention to detail and how thorough you are, I'm sure you put a lot of work and effort into what you produce, and I really appreciate that approach. So I just wanted to thank you for that.
Well, thank you very much. I definitely appreciate, the appreciation of the diligence and the kind of pedantic, footnotery that goes into all this. I know I get a lot out of that, so it's good to hear that somebody else does as well. And thank you again both for having me here. It's been great being on the show.
Well, thanks, Chris.
Okay, that was Chris Plaisance. Christopher Plaisance is a wonderful guy. He's an excellent scholar, rigorous, intelligent, very intelligent, profound, deep thinker. And I think a lot of that was reflected in our discussion. Our interview with him is part of an ongoing series which focuses on theurgy, especially theurgy in the Neoplatonic tradition, but it's not limited to that. So to that end, we feel that he very much is in harmony with our prior guests, Greg Shaw, Edward Butler, Angela Voss, just to name a few. Wonderful people, brilliant people, and people doing really important research, cutting-edge research on this subject. In order to really understand the topic of theurgy, of invocating and evocating the gods, it's important to allow yourself to have an encounter with the seminal work of some of these scholars who have contributed so much to our understanding. Chris is advancing that understanding as well, and we're grateful for it, and we're grateful that his book has been published. I loved talking to him. I think he brought some really important points to the table, and though to some it may seem like splitting hairs when we're talking about evocating versus invocating and things like that, it's actually very important to understand this technical terminology. This is an art, this is a science, and we have to understand that the practitioners of this art and science were very much focused on the technical details of it because they were practicing something that was in effect a ritual technology. And technology cannot be sloppy. In order to effectively interact with the interior immaterial realm and produce effects, whether material or immaterial, there needs to be a very sharp, clear, focused understanding of the means whereby to achieve these ends. And I think that Chris's work is valuable in that.
Absolutely. He's meticulous. He looks at these works in a very systematic way. I think it's valuable. I mean, like you said, it's art and science. Sometimes we need to look at it from more of an artist perspective, and sometimes it's valuable to look at it. Of course, it's not science, but from a more technical perspective, because there is a rhyme and a reason of why things are done certain ways. Often it's poetic, but often, like you said, it's a technology. There's a reason for it. And his book is just one piece of the puzzle, which will help kind of clarify and illuminate how these practitioners, these operators, were doing what they were doing and why they were doing what they were doing. So it's very, very valuable in that regard. It's a fairly short work. Like I said to Chris, I've already read it 3 times. I've been back and forth with it. The things that he outlines in the book are going to help you understand the ancient mind or the late antique mind, if that's what you're into. If not, it's still a pretty interesting book, and it is technical, like we've mentioned. So don't let that hold you back. Maybe turn it up a notch and and dive in with a little bit more of an active participation with this work. You're going to need it.
Yeah, I mean, the fact is, if you really want to understand the magical papyri, whether the Greek magical papyri, the Demotic magical papyri, what you encounter in the Coptic Handbook of Ritual Power, or any of the other myriad texts which form the sort of the constellated universe of this pattern of magical practice, you do need to understand on a deeper level. Yes, you can jump in and do the magic, and that's fine, but I think a thorough study of Iamblichus is almost, if not a prerequisite, should be concomitant with your practice. Looking into what people like Greg Shaw and Chris and others have written should also be on your agenda. The more you understand the way the ancient magicians and Goetes and theurgists saw this, the better your results are going to be. Do not be daunted by intellectual study. Many of these people were trained philosophers or priests or priestesses. That type of training is not a haphazard thing where you can be a scrappy bloke off the streets who doesn't know anything and is just jumping in and making some tools. This isn't a romantic novel set in turn of the century times during the Industrial Revolution. This is a historical period that actually existed where people were actually doing this kind of magic, and many of these people were educated, often within a temple context. And when they weren't educated within a temple context, they were educated within a philosophical school. And there was, according to Giles Quispel, as we've mentioned on prior episodes, a Hermetic lodge operating in Alexandria at the time of the writing of the PGM and PDM as well. And it is certain that those Hermetists would have been very aware of this material and would very likely have employed it. Consider the spell of Harpocrates we discussed in this episode. That is an excellent example of that. Harpocrates was central to this. So, Dom, you have anything else to add?
It is a muddy area of history, so just like all of history, actually, the more you delve in and look at it from different angles, like with what Chris is doing, what others are doing, you get a more clear picture. For us, theurgy is always in the background, but there is definitely an element of folk magic in the PGM. There's definitely higher magic being done, and it's all kind of intertwined. So it's good to get as much perspective as possible. Having said that, I think it is time to move on to our book review segment. What do you got for us today, Janice?
So I want to touch on a book that, with all of the hot, sexy new books coming out on how to be an instant magician in 5 minutes or less and do, the 72 Shem diamonds of the PGM, Hameferesh, Goetia. We're missing some really important books that have been done by people who are maybe a little bit more serious. This is a book called Occult Traditions. It was published by Newman Books in 2012. It's an excellent book. It's a compilation of essays. Many of them deal with the Greek magical papyri. Many of these people, if not all of them, are practitioners. It has contributions from the ever wonderful Damon Zacharias Lycourinus, Aaron Cheek, who we've had on the show, David Rankin, Ioannis Marathakis, Christopher Smith, Gwendolyn Toyton, Tess Dawson, Sarita Deste, Matthew Levi Stevens, and others, including our Christopher Plaisance. He has an essay in this compilation as well, which is very interesting. Christopher's contribution to this is the hierarchical cosmos, occult theology as a direct continuation of Neoplatonism. he also contributed From Conjurer to Philosopher, a comparative analysis of medieval and Renaissance angel magic. His work in this is, as usual, excellent. And as you can see, it is also, again, the work of somebody who is deeply immersed in this. I also just want to mention there's several other excellent essays here. Damon's essays are great. Conjuring Magical Assistance in the Greek Magical Papyri. The Spell of Paneuthus as a mystery rite in the Greek Magical Papyri is another great one that Damon put in here. And there's several other just really interesting essays here. Mentioning Solomonic magic, Ioannis Marothakis wrote A Source of the Key of Solomon, the Magic Treatise or Hygromancy or Epistle to Rehoboam. And as I think many of our listeners may know, the Hygromantia is it displays connections to the PGM. There seems to be evidence of a line of transmission of the magic, which I think also connected to the Picatrix as well. So there's just some really interesting stuff. And in addition to essays discussing magical subjects, there are also even a couple of rites in here. The Calling and Adoration of Ion and the Spell of the Mystic Flame from Daemon. The Hymnic Adoration and Invocation of Thoth by Daemon. And the Eucharistic Feast of Agathodaimon by Companion Abraxas. And these are really just nice rites, which, drawing on this tradition, are faithful to it, while at the same time, being modern creations which are based on these things. So you're getting theory in this book, you're getting practice in this book, and the nice thing is it's kind of a reflection of our aspiration with this show. This book goes pretty deeply into, theory, theology, philosophy, and practice all together. So it doesn't leave out either side. The book is written in a scholarly manner. Each essay has footnotes. I also want to, I can't not mention Aaron Cheek's contribution to Waters, Animating and Annihilating, Apotheosis by Drowning in the Greek Magical Papyri. That's a huge subject. If you're familiar with the papyri, there's a lot of drowning going on, and this all relates back to the drowning of Osiris and in the river. So it does go back to Egyptian theology. So the concept of ritual drowning as a process of divinization is addressed here too. It's an excellent book. I can't recommend it enough, and I feel as though it may have fallen by the wayside with the increased popularity of the PGM, and I think that's kind of a travesty, because this is work done before the current fad was in effect. And I believe that Damon Zacharias Lakurinos, he's the one who edited and compiled this. And though he tends to keep a low profile online, his work is exemplary. He's an intelligent, excellent magician. And so I have to give credit where credit's due here. And I have to say, I really love this book, and I consider it an indispensable contribution to my library, in the area of my library that is devoted to this subject.
And the name of the book, again?
Occult Traditions. I think it should be. I don't know if it's in print anymore. I'm uncertain about that. But if it's not, it should be brought back into print.
Thank you for doing that great review. That sounds like an awesome book I need to get my hands on. I think we are through with the episode. Thanks again to Chris Plaisance. And as far as us, you can find us everywhere we normally tell you to find us. So YouTube, you can subscribe to our channel, Facebook, you can like us there. We're on iTunes and all the other pod places. Give us a review and a rating. That would be very nice of you. We would appreciate it.
Yep. Thanks, everybody. You're very much appreciated. Stay cool. Stay strong.
Stay safe.
Stay safe right now. And, try and stay engaged with your spiritual or magical practice as much as you're able to, because it will not only bring you stability, but it will also strengthen your ability to cope with the many changes that are going on in our world right now.
Absolutely. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next time.